It looks like we have our first batch of participants in. So because we have a short period of time, we're going to just welcome you right away and get started with the proceedings as others come into the room. So thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to Adapting Economic Inclusion Programs in Fragile and Conflict Affected Settings. Really happy to have you. Hope you were able to attend some of the sessions this morning and found them pretty engaging. We're going to try and keep up some of that energy. And we will do so because we have a fantastic panel, a sorted panel gathered today, which hopefully will really provide some interesting observations on economic inclusion programs in fragile contexts. You're going to be hearing from Afghanistan, where we have a long-standing economic inclusion program, in Yemen, a successful program supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises with a market-oriented approach. And we'll learn about Mauritania, which is not in itself an FCV context, but is surrounded by countries in conflict. And so economic inclusion program, or rather it's serving as a bit of a buffer country within that context. So we'll learn a little bit about the experiences there. I want to just start with a little bit of housekeeping, if that's okay. So this session is going to be presented to you in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic languages. Please look in your chat box for instructions on how to select the relevant language. You look for that globe icon down at the bottom and you can select the language there. If you're having any connection issues, either to the language interpretation services or even just in general, please put a little note in the chat box and our IT folks will get on it and try and help you out. And please use the chat box to chat. We look forward to exchange with you. We'd love to hear more about your interest and your questions, and there will be a couple of times where we'll have time for questions along the way. And then finally, what we at the Partnership for Economic Inclusion are quite interested in gathering materials and resources and information that might be relevant. So if you or your organization have resources that relate to this topic and are interested to share with PEI and thereby with other organizations, please do share those. Sending an email to peimt@worldbank.org, and we'll put that email address in the chat box as well, so that you have access to them. So I want to start with a little introduction of our panelists first. Safiya Aljabr is the Executive Director of the Small and Micro Enterprise Promotion Services, which is known as SMEPS, and that's a subsidiary of the Social Fund for Development in Yemen. Previously, she was the Deputy Executive Director in a leading national humanitarian NGO in Yemen. So welcome, Safiya. Ziad Ayoubi works for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as the Deputy Representative in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Earlier, Ziad was based in Geneva and was the head of Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Unit there, coordinating their strategy. So welcome, Ziad. Glad to have you today. Khalil Baheer, who you might have seen in a video earlier in the morning session, unfortunately was unable to join us in person, but was kind enough to send a video. Khalil is the Director of Programs at the Microfinance Investment Support Facility for Afghanistan, which is known as MISFA, which is an apex institution that supports microfinance and SME sectors at the national level. So we'll look forward to hearing from him. And we're also joined by Aidan Coville, who is a senior economist with the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation, or DIME group, and he's managing the unit on infrastructure and climate change. So welcome, Aidan. Aidan has been working closely with Khalil on some evaluation of the Afghanistan program. So he'll be here to tell us a little bit more about how that works. So once again, welcome to our session. We thought it might be helpful to get started with a bit of a framing session. So as you will have heard, or you may know, the Partnership for Economic Inclusion has conducted a survey of organizations engaged in economic inclusion programs worldwide. And so we produced in January the State of Economic Inclusion Report 2021. And we thought it might be helpful just to look at what's happening in economic inclusion as it relates to fragile and conflict affected settings, to get a bit of a better understanding of what's happening and where we are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, let's start with a definition. We use, not surprisingly, the World Bank classification of countries that are FCV countries or fragile conflict and violence affected countries, where institutional and social fragility are evident, and where violent conflict is also where violent conflict is also an element. Not surprisingly, we've been hearing, and we all know, that conditions in FCV contexts as elsewhere are worsening. It's estimated that by 2030, perhaps up to 2/3 of the world's extreme poor might be living in FCV settings. And we know that the conditions have been worsening even over the past year, where we now see that 23 million people are, as Shomaron said in the first setting, the new poor, potentially those folks that are moving into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And the expectation is that GDP will be affected even more direly than it might otherwise have been. Next slide, please. When we dive into the details of the findings, we see that the State of Economic Inclusion report surveyed a whole number of different organizations and programs and identified 219 that it reports on in the report. 26% of those programs are focused on FCV countries, so that's a fairly considerable number. And we find that the majority of those are in sub-Saharan Africa, with another smaller amount in MENA region, in Middle East and North Africa. And as you can see from the slide on the right, most programs are led by, or many programs, I should say, are led by NGOs or multilateral operations, 59% of those programs. And there on the right, you can see government-led programs are fewer in FCV contexts than they are in non-FCV contexts. Next slide, please. Economic inclusion programs. So when we start to look at various different ways in which program design takes place, we understand that design objectives are critical, understanding who the target population is important, and the objectives of the program obviously as well. First, we can see, not surprisingly, that objectives increasing or predominantly in FCV contexts are focused on resilience and social inclusion and food security, not at all surprising, but you can imagine how those would impact program design as opposed to a program whose primary objective is women's empowerment or diversification or something like that. So that plays an important role in how these programs take shape. Like many other economic inclusion programs, we find that most economic inclusion programs in FCV settings have 5 to 6 components, which make them reasonably complex programs. And as you can see on the right, there's quite a lot of diversity in terms of what those components actually are, what they include. And so that too can help shape the design of a program. And some of that variation is very likely due to what partnerships are possible in this sort of environment, and what sort of services are required by people who are living in poverty in those areas. Target populations, similar to other programs, are women, and quite a strong focus on youth, and not surprisingly on displaced populations as well. So with that little grounding, we can now see how these programs have taken shape and learn a little bit more about what they look like on the ground. But of course, nothing is going to give us a better sense of that than talking to our panelists more. However, you've now heard a little bit about us, and you've heard a little bit about FCV settings. So we'd just like to hear a little bit from you and understand what kinds of experiences you've had thus far, and what your understanding is of the biggest challenges in economic inclusion programs in FCV settings. So if we can have that first poll up, I want a reminder to please go to menti.com. And I believe we'll see a code on the screen, which should allow us to enter into the Menti poll there. And we're really trying to understand, what do we think are the biggest challenges or the most challenging aspects of working in FCV contexts from your perspective.
I will share the screen with the Menti poll in a second.
Thank you. What we'll be hearing from our panelists later on, not surprisingly, is that the number of challenges that emerge from these sorts of settings and contexts vary quite tremendously. So here you can see, we want to go to menti.com, please, on your phones, and enter the code let's just see if I can read that, 4704-9079. So that's 4704-9079. And the question is, what are the most challenging aspects of working in fragile, conflict-affected, and violent contexts that you have experienced or that you anticipate? And we ask that you choose all that apply. And these can include coordination between humanitarian, development, and government actors, insecurity, number 2, insecurity of staff or participant. Number 3, infrastructure, mobility, or connectivity challenges. Number 4, funding flexibility to meet participant and community needs. And votes are coming in, and I see that I need glasses because I can't read what that is. One moment, please. What on earth does that say? Information, no, the first one, coordination. The coordination piece is key, isn't it? This is where I very cheekily plug a session on the last day of the workshop on partnership, but we'll be talking about that a little bit here too. Partnership coordination is absolutely critical. What we saw from the SEI results was that lots of different components in a program mean lots of coordination is critical. So that's great. Now we'd like to hear a little bit from you about, in our next poll, about what kinds of displaced populations have you worked with in the past or are working with now. Number 1, refugees or asylum seekers. Number 2, internally displaced people. Number 3, returnees. And number 4, host communities. And once again, please select all of those that apply. And it's quite an unusual panel because we have panelists, we have countries who are dealing with each of these populations, and that's not always common. So it looks like internally displaced populations and refugees overwhelmingly are, between the two of them, are the majority of populations that we're working with. But look at host communities coming in for the late surge. Not surprisingly, a lot of programs are utilizing or are working with both affected populations, displacement affected populations, and host communities. So that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Now, I think what we'll do is have a chat with our first panelist, Safiya. Safiya, the conflict in Yemen, we know, is worsening, and it's entering its 6th year. It's considered one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with more than 3.5 million people thought to be displaced as a result of this conflict. Then in the past year, of course, we've seen COVID, and there's been tremendous flooding in Yemen, which has really made conditions worse for people living in extreme poverty. And yet, your organization, SMEPS, has been working in Yemen since 2005 and quite effectively supporting economic development through private sector development. So I wonder how, if you can tell us how you've been conducting business in all this time and what's happening with your organization now.
Yes, hi, thank you, Janet, and hi, everyone in the panel and joining the session today. So rightfully said, SMEPS has been working in Yemen since 2005. It's a subsidiary of the Social Fund for Yemen and was developed as an economic arm for the Social Fund for Development to support the economic growth and resilience in MSMEs through 3 main thematic areas. So through the value chain development, business development services, and entrepreneurship. So we've actually worked at both the policy level and specifically with entrepreneurship in terms of developing different curriculums for youth and women with the IFC and ILO, and at the technical level to support the growth of vital economic sectors such as coffee, agriculture, fisheries, livestock, and health. And our programs since 2015 have really followed, since the onset of the conflict, have really followed creative approaches of bridging the humanitarian development nexus to supporting these sectors. So we didn't have a shift in the mandate of what we did, but we were creative enough to have approaches that could work in supporting the same sectors, but with the main goals of improving food security, livelihoods, job creation, and access to basic services for vulnerable and affected population. And so so for the graduation program that you just mentioned, and for what we have been working in SMEPS, it's a wide idea that we have. But as an example, we've been supporting women livestock breeders in rural areas through skills training, coaching, asset transfers, with the main goal of increasing their incomes, productivity, improving household food consumption, and access to basic services. And we've been using the markets for the poor approach. And this sector has had the biggest impact in terms of all the mentioned indicators. And we are also implementing some programs in terms of vocational training to support youth and women to either start or expand micro businesses with the same goals of improved livelihoods, and again through the markets for the poor approach. And so we have designed a migration program to support women, specifically cash for nutrition beneficiaries benefiting either from WFP projects in terms of humanitarian assistance, or social protection beneficiaries from the social fund to move to such kind of livelihood support. Over to you, Janet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really interesting work underway at the moment. And what's been interesting to learn about is really how SMEPS has been developing from the beginning a multi-dimensional approach to economic empowerment of these small and micro enterprises in Yemen. And with a particular focus on women. And I think I remember reading that when you were beginning to focus on women more, that multidimensional nature, the sort of need to reach out a little bit more carefully to women was critical. Can you talk a little bit about how those programs sort of have led you to a new consideration about potentially targeting people living in extreme poverty?
With the programs that we've really supported in terms of rural livelihoods, one of the examples I've given you is the livestock support that we provide to rural livestock breeders. But one program that I really wanted to speak about today in terms of supporting women is called the BRAVE program. So the BRAVE program is a brave program, but it literally stands for Business Resilience for Value-Added Enterprises. And it's a program that was designed to support the resilience of SMEs through the conflicts rather than after the conflict as the traditional kind of like approach. And so in 2015, what we did, we conducted a business climate survey to study the initial impact of conflict on SMEs. And we found out that over 80% were forced to close down, and women-owned businesses or enterprises were more vulnerable to shocks. And so at that time, we had also finished piloting a matching grant scheme with the World Bank in 2014 to support SME expansion and job creation. And so with these two, the experience that we had in the business climate survey, we designed this project with the Islamic Development Bank. And so the project has finished. The first two phases of the project are already done. And now we have the Brave Women project, which is only focusing on women-owned enterprises, which is the third phase. It will complete in 2022. And the idea, again, of these programs were to basically increase, job creation for the SMEs, sustain existing jobs, strengthen SMEs. I'm not seeing the slide, sorry, that you were supposed to be sharing, but anyway, so strengthening SME access to finance, improving access to markets. Thank you so much. Providing SME owners with skills, networking, capacity building. And one thing that we really focused on as well was to sustain demand and investment through value chain and SME linkages. The way that we really, next slide, please. The way that we really designed the project was having an approach that could work around the ecosystem of the SMEs at a time where we knew that market players existed, but each one of them were facing problems in terms of having motivation to be part of such programs. And so we worked through training institutes, input suppliers, business advisors, banking sector, and other business service providers such as the chambers of commerce and business management organization. And so the modalities that we really used in supporting these businesses sustain and be resilient were conditional cash transfers through a matching grant scheme. And the idea was to basically support them as well with technical support through entrepreneurship, business training, coaching, and advisory services. Next slide, please. And so because of the success of these projects, we are going to be replicating the same projects. They're going to be replicated in other fragile contexts. So we have the Brave Women, which is starting in Nigeria and soon into Burkina Faso. And what we've done is to exchange technical knowledge and transfer in-house developed platforms to these countries as well. Next slide, please. I think, I'm not so sure if we have enough time for this, Janet, but we can move it to the next discussion in terms of the recommendations and lessons that we've learned in terms of supporting both rural livelihoods and SMEs. So over to you, Janet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Safiya. That gives us a really nice understanding of how these programs took shape and sort of how that segued a little bit into economic inclusion for not only SMEs, but also thinking a little bit more broadly, as you mentioned. Appreciate too your punting those final questions to the final observations on learning to our roundtable discussion later. I think that will fit in really nicely to that strategy. Just wanted to highlight a couple of questions from the audience today. Can you tell us, how do you deal with moving populations in conflict settings? So a solid household registry for nomadic populations. Are you dealing with nomadic populations or IDPs, I believe, in your area? And if so, how do you deal with that sort of that level of mobility?
So our approach really is to support, as I mentioned, rural livelihoods with asset transfers, so that we focus on IDPs that are in host communities. So the idea is to have a very flexible target mechanism, which can really include IDPs in these host communities, because we do have the UNHCR and IOM who really focus on IDPs in camps. And so the way that we've really approached is also to support youth and women who have micro businesses or livelihood kind of like opportunities. And we do support them again with skills training. They are part of our program. So we have a very flexible targeting mechanism that really is inclusive of these kind of like populations as well. And I hope that really answers the question of Marvi.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So much interesting activity going on at the at this, and especially in a conflict situation such as this. So from SMEPS, where we've heard about this important work and really interesting work with SMEs, we can move now to Afghanistan. So as I mentioned, Khalil Baheer was not able to join us on our panel today, but he has prepared a video for us. But Aidan, can you come in quickly and describe for us what MISFA is and sort of what their program looks like? And then we'll pivot to the video.
Sure, thanks, Janet. So we've been very lucky to have been able to work with MISFA for the last 6 years. They are the microfinance investment support facility for Afghanistan. And so they are basically the apex microfinance institution in the country. They're owned by the Ministry of Finance, but they are independently financed. And MISFA has actually been, they've been working on these economic inclusion programs actually for the last 10 years already, starting at a very sort of small scale, but with really the idea of trying to understand how to help ultra poor households move out of extreme poverty, but also start to improve access to formal financial services. So they're targeting the Ultra Poor program, which is the TUP, has now been scaled to 11 provinces. It's sort of a very similar model to what we've talked about and heard about in some of the other sessions, where it's basically got a productive asset, which typically is a cow or livestock, combined with access to savings accounts, temporary cash support, skills training, coaching, and other complementary services, and they come together with support for education and health as well. And so, unfortunately, as you mentioned, Mr. Baheer is not able to join us in person, but he has a short video which we can now share and explain a lot more about all the great things they're doing over there. Thanks, Janet.
Khalil Baheer, the Director of Program for Microfinance Investment Support Facility for Afghanistan. Good morning to the plenary members. Sorry that I cannot be available because of the time difference. We have been implementing the graduation of the Ultra Poor program for the last 10 years. And the reason that we have been implementing this program is because we are owned by the government. I know that in other countries, this graduation model is part of their social protection policy. But in Afghanistan, MISFA has been implementing this program because it's owned by the government. And the second thing is that we have been also supporting the microfinance institutions in Afghanistan. So it is very easy for us to work with the microfinance institution in terms of the linkages of the graduation model graduates. And also it really is easy, and we have the leverage over the microfinance institutions to design very friendly and easily manageable products for the graduates. So Afghanistan right now, the poverty rate is 70%, and I think when you have 70% poverty rate, so graduation model is one of the best solution. And then Afghanistan is also very mountainous countries, and then sometimes the cost is a little bit high for development projects. So we, of course, that we have insurgency, instability, political instability, and all that. Our government development budget is also dependent on the international donors. So how we do the graduation model? We have 4 components. We have health, market linkages, the social component, the health component, because you cannot tackle poverty through a single intervention. You have to have multiple interventions, and so that's we have to get employment for people. You have to link them with the health services, because most of the poor families they spend their money on the hygiene, because when their kids go to toilet, they don't want to wash hands. They don't take into consideration the hygiene issue in their kitchen. So we have to work on that side. We have to also once people become poor, so they are mainly segregated from the mainstream of the society. So you have to work with them to bring them back to the mainstream of the society. So you need the social component as well there. Market link is very important, because if they have a asset and they cannot link with them, they don't have access to market. So where they should sell their product and where they should gain the income. So what happened? We did a cut of paste of this model from another country. In 2010, we piloted here, but unfortunately, it didn't work. So we had to customize this program. For example, this was for 36 months. We had to reduce it to 24 months. We have been providing livestock, productive livestock to the beneficiary in terms of cows, sheep, and goats. And this is working very well in the rural area, but unfortunately in urban area it doesn't work, because people are not familiar with rearing cows. So now we are working in one of the cities in Jalalabad with 80 families. It's just a pilot. We want to see the result, and we want to see how we implement it. We have to learn from this. So this that program was evaluated by 3 actors. The DIAM team has been evaluating this program in Balkh province since 2015. And then the government of Afghanistan, the Ministry of Economy, also implemented this program, and they consider that this is very success program, and they recommended this program to the government of Afghanistan that if they can fund this program, because we have 70% of the poverty rate. So we have a very good support from the government, and we have also very good implementing partners, the national NGOs. We have delivery system, we have capacity here at the MISFA, but the big issue, the big challenge is the funding, because beyond June of 2021, we do not have any commitment from donors to support this program. So this is our worry, and this is our our concern, that 10 years experience, successful experience, with evidence. So this program probably will come to an end if we do not receive commitment from donor to continue with this program. Otherwise, we have all the support from private sector, and this is well accepted here in Afghanistan, and the result is they are very tangible results. And if colleagues are interested, the report is there, and also we can share the reports from other institutions that did the impact study on this program. So thank you very much. And if there is any question, I'll be happy to take it. Thank you.
Thanks to Khalil for that presentation. Really interesting information. And Aidan, we know that funding flows are a big challenge, right, in humanitarian and development settings alike. Can you tell us a little bit more about Khalil's note that the program might be ending because of funding flows?
Yeah, sure. So as he had described, the program in different forms has been going over the last 10 years, from sort of small scale now to more medium scale across 11 provinces. And the World Bank has been supporting over the last 7 years through the IDA lending to support the project as it's been rolling out, and that's coming to a close in June. And now the question is really how to support and move forward in the future, and where this can look like, right? And I think the great thing about the work is that there's been impact evaluation work done both by ourselves in DIME as well as some other partners that Mr. Baheer had mentioned, and all of this is pointing to the fact that this is actually a very cost-effective program. So not only is it changing lives, but it's also delivering high rates of return, right? And so thinking about it in the future, obviously there's a lot of instability and a lot of things going on in Afghanistan at the moment with all the transitions that are happening. But work like these graduation programs can be supporting not just during conflict times, but also in sort of peace transition periods as well, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for these types of programs, but also, a lot of challenges, as we've heard, with donor coordination and things like that, to see what is possible going forward.
Thank you. It is quite interesting to hear how these challenges persist, how a program that's been underway for a long time with a good base of evidence is nonetheless thinking about these funding challenges. But important to note, as you say, and as Abhijit Banerjee mentioned in the first session, these programs don't have to last forever to show a good impact. It's important at a household level for these kinds of changes to take place. It's important for us to acknowledge all that's happened in those 11 provinces. And we'll hope for the best as it relates to other kinds of funding opportunities. Just wondering, here's a question from Chris Payne at Concern Worldwide. He's wondering whether it's feasible to look at domestic sources for the program in Afghanistan. Do you happen to know, Aidan, whether that's feasible?
Domestic funding sources, is that the question?
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So I described it a little bit earlier. The sort of design of MISFA is really that it's housed and sort of supported through the Ministry of Finance, but it's independently financed, right? And so the way the financing has been structured is that external donors and partners would be coming in to finance the work that MISFA does, and not necessarily directly through government financing itself. So in that specific model, then it's looking at external financing, but there have been other sort of variations of the program with the Ministry of Agriculture and others thinking about how to deliver this work with domestic financing. I may not be the best person to answer that question, so I don't want to go further on that. Our colleague Aminata is also on the line, who leads the program from the bank side. In case she wants to add to that, that'd be great.
I think that's quite interesting to identify that particularly unique role that MISFA has within the Ministry of Finance, not dissimilar. Very interesting to see these two economic inclusion programs in Yemen and in Afghanistan having similar relationships with government entities, and also some vulnerabilities as it relates to that funding. So we can explore that, pardon me, a little bit further later on. But now I'd like to hear a little bit from, having heard from these two programs operating in conflict contexts, I'd love to hear from Ziad Ayoubi, who is with UNHCR, and we'll get his presentation up on the screen now. And UNHCR has been testing the graduation approach in over 10 countries, first working sort of directly with UNHCR, and then now supporting NGOs who are utilizing the graduation approach for refugees, for displaced populations and refugees overall. But you now lead the livelihood team in Mauritania. You now are the deputy representative in Mauritania, I should say. And while Mauritania isn't an FCV country, it's nonetheless, as I've described, sort of surrounded by countries that are in conflict. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about UNHCR's role there and share with us a little bit about what's happening now.
Thank you so much, Janet, for the introduction. So Mauritania, as you said, is a country that is spared somehow from any conflict currently, but it's surrounded by at least two conflicts. You have the conflict in Mali, where many refugees are crossing the border to Mauritania. We have at least 65,000 Malian refugees living in the Bera camp at the border with Mali. And there is the other conflict, which is towards the north, which is the Western Sahara conflict. That is a very protracted conflict. It's not producing a significant amount of refugee situation in Mauritania, but the risk is always there. So currently, the operation in Mauritania is an operation that is focusing on Malian refugees, in addition to many other nationalities. But the biggest caseload is Malian refugees in Bera camp, in the southeast Bera camp. It's a protracted situation. The situation started in 2012, the second wave of refugees. So in usual terms, we say it's a protracted situation. It's not an emergency. Despite the border closure because of COVID, still we can see around 3,000 refugees entering per year due to the conflict in Mauritania. In Mali. There is always a risk of having this number increase because of the dynamic of the conflict in Mali. We never know. We might have a bigger influx at some point. Now, in terms of the role of UNHCR and the role of the other agencies, so Mauritania is one of the countries where there is a development investment in the refugee and the forced displacement situation. It's not one of the traditional humanitarian operation, actually. It's where, in Mauritania, it's where you can see humanitarian operation, but also development interventions. The AIDA, the World Bank AIDA 18 classified Mauritania as eligible in 2018, and 4 World Bank projects were approved in March 2020. We have 4 projects: social protection, health, urbanization, WASH, with an amount that reached around $70 million. In the next slide, I'm listing few sectors. So as any other humanitarian operation, there are many UN agencies. There are at least 20 partners working in Bera camp and surrounding areas. There are 9 sectors related to the humanitarian interventions, protection, child protection, gender-based violence, education, and name it. However, what is very important, so this is usually what happens in forced displacement and refugee operations. But what is very important here, what I want to allude to, is in the next slide, the humanitarian interventions that these organizations are doing are complemented by development efforts. So if in this slide, I'm somehow showing what is core humanitarian and protection, but what is also beyond the core. To give an example, just few examples, humanitarian organizations like WFP and UNHCR are giving cash and food assistance based on humanitarian principles. But then you have the social protection program of the government expanding this and ensuring inclusion in the national system. So we started with the humanitarian, but we are expanding through the national development. Another example is health. In the health sector, as usual, humanitarian organizations, the first thing they do when they arrive is to provide healthcare. And this is usually done by national or international NGO partners. But if you look at this slide, you will see that the health is actually expanded by a national program of health. It's called Inaya, funded by the World Bank, but fully embedded in the Ministry of Health. So these are examples where the core humanitarian intervention is complemented by development efforts. Now to go a little bit more in details regarding the economic inclusion, the next slide is actually about the economic inclusion. I don't know if we can jump to the next slide in the... Okay. No, the one before. The one before. Sorry. Yes, here. So to describe a little bit how we see the economic inclusion and livelihoods for refugees in a forced displacement situation. There are many challenges that we are facing. There are education challenges. The population is now enrolling children in schools. However, there is very, very few who can reach secondary and tertiary education. Majority of the population is in the primary education. So in addition to this challenge, there are many other challenges like limited economic situation, limited markets. It's an isolated place. There are also environmental issues, climate issues. However, if you look at the middle of this slide, you can see that there is positive rules and regulations, which makes the enabling environment there. And this is about the welcoming policy of Mauritania. It's some legal framework elements, the registration, the documentation. So there is a good protection environment in the country, which makes the programs and services, which is the chapeau in this middle of the slide, more effective. So, and here I can go back to the issue of the World Bank programs. If World Bank comes in a place where there is no enabling environment, it would make it a lot difficult to achieve good results and positive results, which is on the right of the slide. I want to jump to the next slide to just give a quick, non-exhaustive list of economic inclusion efforts.
Perfect, Ziad. And we'll wrap up just after this slide. So just 1 minute, yes, or 30 seconds.
Sure. So collectively, the number of organizations working there are giving support, business development training, cash for social protection, but also cash for entrepreneurship. A microfinance institution is there. There are many livestock and agricultural interventions. So as you see in the list, there is a variety of interventions that all together take the population and the host community towards self-reliance and economic inclusion, supported by a very good enabling environment. I will stop here for the sake of time. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Ziad. And so interesting to see how this sort of wraparound service can help in a refugee context, but really integration as well with other services, with other government services on offer to these refugees. Quite an extraordinary kind of situation. And I think, as Marvi mentions in the comments, integration, as she mentioned earlier, with policy is absolutely critical to ensuring that these interventions last beyond just one government cycle, right? Can you tell me, I saw one question here. There was a question about how, when multiple agencies are working together, and we'll talk a little bit about this. This will sort of segue nicely into our fireside chat. We'll talk a little bit more about partnership for us. When all of these organizations are working together, how are we ensuring that there isn't duplication of services? How does that coordination happen in your context in Mauritania?
Thanks, Janet, for this question. It's very important. There is the traditional coordination mechanism, the refugee coordination model, led mainly by UNHCR and the regional authorities, the local authorities in Bera camp, which is at the southeast. This model ensures that humanitarian organizations are working together in working groups, working on thematic areas, protection, education, livelihoods, and so on. So that's, let's say, the core coordination element that is very much regional and not very much national. When we come to the development interventions, World Bank and other development interventions, the need was very clear to expand the refugee coordination model to do something else. And this is where UNHCR is playing a role with the government at the level of the ministries in Nouakchott, to establish a mechanism where we can sit together, humanitarian and development, in order to plan together and to complement interventions. If a national organization or an international NGO, let's say, I don't know, I don't want to mention names now, but an NGO doing WASH activities, and the World Bank is coming to connect the water network to the government department, to the government management. This NGO needs to sit with the World Bank specialists and the Ministry of Water in order to work together a transition, a handover somehow. So this UNHCR is working with the line ministries at the central level here in Nouakchott, and we recently received a decree issued by the Ministry of Interior to establish a coordination commission for development programs targeting refugees and host communities. So this shows how we are, moving from the humanitarian to development, transitioning while putting everybody in one place and discussing the interventions.
Fantastic. Really important consideration, these sorts of collaborations, and also the timing and the sequencing of these sorts of activities, right? As you mentioned, a transition from one service provider, if you like, to another. Our poll revealed that there's real interest and concern around challenges around this coordination question. Safiya, I know you're very conscious from your own experience and also from SMEPS of this importance of connection and work between development and humanitarian actors. Can you tell us a little bit about what that coordination looks like in Yemen? How is it working? And whether you've got an example of how it works well or how it doesn't work so well?
Yes, to be honest, in the context of Yemen, a lot of work really needs to be done in this aspect in terms of really coordinating the humanitarian development kind of like approach to supporting different categories of beneficiaries. It's been really challenging to get humanitarian actors to think a bit different. We are 6 years into the conflict. There has been a bit of adaptability in terms of how the conflict, conflicts are different, fragility is different from one country to another country. And so really we've been seeing beneficiaries also, getting humanitarian aid and staying in the same pockets of poverty for quite a long time. A long period of time, and it's really difficult to have that kind of like thinking. In Yemen, the coordination mechanism between humanitarian and development actors is not really that strong. There has been discussions because at the end of the day, you have actors who look at the humanitarian crisis in Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and so most of the support really goes into providing food baskets and so on, rather than really focusing on what systems are there and how do we support these systems to continue functioning, markets and other systems around beneficiaries, basically. And so that balance is not there in the country, and it's really been challenging. And I think one of the things that we've been discussing with the World Bank and big development actors working in the country is to really find a layering approach to supporting beneficiaries. So not really a graduation, but probably migrating beneficiaries. Those beneficiaries getting cash for nutrition, cash plus social protection. How do we really move them to partners working in livelihoods and sustainable kind of like solutions towards livelihoods, asset transfers, SMEs, and so on. And so these are still discussions being currently undertaken in the country. And we do hope that something really materializes from this quite soon.
So interesting to think about all of the, how things are working and how they're not particularly working well in some of these coordination efforts, right? It sounds like SMEPS is at the heart of trying to bring together these two actors or two groups of actors and playing a key role in thinking about that strategy for other populations to get multiple services. And there was a question in the chat about how exactly this coordination happens, and also about data and data sharing. And I wanted to find out a little bit more about how some of your programs are utilizing data, monitoring data, evaluation data, et cetera, and evidence in order to take decisions, in order to prove and improve. We talked this morning about the need to influence finance ministers and what does that data look like, and how is it or isn't it influencing their thinking. Aidan, I wonder if you can talk about some of the research and evidence that's been underway with MISPA. You've been deeply involved in this. Can you talk a little bit about what may be relevant to FCB contexts elsewhere and what we're learning?
Yeah, sure. So I guess our journey sort of started in 2014. So actually 6-7 years ago now, and we started working with MISFA. So ourselves coming from the Development Impact Evaluation Group within the World Bank. So we basically help various different programs around the world across different geographies and across different sectors to really understand, what is the causal impact of their program, and really try to understand what can be done to improve the development impact of these programs. Right? And so we started these discussions with MISFA in 2014. And to be completely honest, like in the beginning, when we were thinking about the scale of this program and how challenging the context would be in Afghanistan, we thought, wow, this is going to be a really hard program to actually sort of deliver on, right, and to achieve. And so I think, over the years, we rolled out this randomized controlled trial with the program to really sort of test the impact of the delivery. And I think there's three things that came out, which are really important for thinking about other FCV settings. So firstly, just the fact that it worked, the fact that you could deliver a program in a setting which is FCV, and we know that, the extreme poor are going to be predominantly living in FCV settings. Knowing what programs can work is really important. And so sort of finding out that there's, not just that it worked, but it delivered really effectively and actually achieving all of the goals of sort of delivering on the asset deliveries, the training, all of these different dimensions, a multi-dimensional program, right? And so that's really important. The second is that not only did it work, but it was highly cost effective, right? And so yes, there's large per capita costs to sort of go into these programs, but we see the returns to these investments. Even if you just look at consumption as the outcome, we see for every $1 put in, you get $2 out in terms of just the returns on investment, right? So that's a bottom line situation. But then third, beyond any of these sort of economic outcomes, we also see in countries like Afghanistan, it's really important to understand what's happening on the gender front, right? And so we see these programs, when they're targeted towards women, we're actually not only improving the households, but also closing the gender gaps on a lot of the really important and big gender gaps that we have on sort of activities in the market, in mental well-being, in access to assets and participation in community engagement, and all of these things. So we're not only just sort of getting a return on investment, but we're actually transforming these lives and improving equality at the same time. So I think across all of these things, that's really important to think about how to deliver these in other FCV settings.
Super important, some very important work going on in women's empowerment, as you said, and some really critical refinements of the program, and especially in the COVID-19 context, as I understand. Safiya, SMEPS also did some research focused on women early on in the conflict to understand exactly what was going on. Can you sort of describe what that looked like and what you learned from that process?
Yes, so initially during the first year of the conflict, we did this survey of surveying MSMEs, and we did find out that women-owned micro and small businesses were much more vulnerable to any shocks rather than male-owned businesses. And so we did design the program that I just spoke about, the Brave Women Project. And the idea was basically to support these women through skills training, access to markets, access to finance, and also providing them with matching grants. So accessing these matching grants through the banking sectors. At the time when the conflict started, the banking sector was facing a lot of liquidity issues. And so supporting any SME to be resilient, to continue and to grow, meant that we needed to support the banking sector as well, and we needed to bring them into the program. And so what we've seen so far is that the banking sector and the financial service providers have really stepped up in terms of supporting women entrepreneurs in the country. There has been an increase, a big increase in terms of women-owned businesses from 2015 to 2020. So the last business climate survey we did was in 2020, and we found out an increase in that. Social norms have really changed. Prior to the conflict, it was men working in public sector and other sectors providing for the households, but now we have women who are pushed into those roles. And so we've seen creative ideas coming from women in terms of, having livelihoods ideas and trying to support their households. And so the program that we've really implemented to support women has been focusing on both rural women in terms of health and in the agriculture sector, and then in urban settings as well. And that's the program that I just spoke about. It was done in a very unique way in very difficult times. And because of that success, it's being replicated right now in Nigeria and Burkina Faso with the same manuals, that operational manuals that we developed in the country, with the same systems that we used in terms of remote monitoring. And I think some of the things that we've learned as well, not just in the research, is that now the learning is becoming more critical, and we should have a critical eye in terms of learning, because as I said, conflicts are different, and different stages of conflict comes with different opportunities as well. And so being smart enough and creative enough to come up with solutions to supporting such initiatives is really important.
Absolutely critical. Couldn't agree more. And also timeliness of this sort of research, right? How are we learning about what's happening on the ground so we can be responsive to those sorts of changes? Really exciting to hear how these innovations are being shared across different countries as well, and even feasible within the context of COVID, doing a lot of this knowledge transfer via Zoom calls, which is fantastic. So we have a super quick question. I just wanted everybody, one of the interesting things about this panel is that we have programs that are focused on different displaced populations. And as we saw at the outset, there's a strong, a lot of attendees are focused on refugees and asylum seekers, but there are also others who are focused on other populations. So very quickly, and this is going to be super hard and annoying for you, but can you tell me for refugees and asylum seekers, Ziad, what is a strategy that seems to be working? What's an adaptation in economic inclusion programs for this population that seems to be effective?
Thank you, Janet. What works well is to take advantage and build and leverage the humanitarian work that is being done and that has been done for years, and start the development work from this baseline instead of starting from the scratch. And what does this mean practically? It's a little bit a vague idea. Let's put it in practical words. When humanitarian interventions are, for example, providing multi-purpose cash, and people are receiving this cash in order to secure their basic needs. Economic inclusion should not disregard this fact and consider it as a dependency syndrome. Economic inclusion should come and work on top of it. And this is very much related to the graduation approach that you have been mentioning. When we consider the humanitarian intervention as the cash stipend targeting refugee households, and we bring in more services to be added to the interventions done by the humanitarian actors, we can link one building block with the other building blocks provided by development interventions. I can see this working very well.
Good, and I'm terribly sorry. I would love to hear from our other panelists, but we have run out of time for our session. There are so many questions and so much great information that's been shared here. We're going to share with you now a poll, please, and ask for you to just let us know how the session went, whether you've learned anything. And that'll help us really understand whether we're getting this right, understanding that timing was very short. Many thanks for your participation. We're going to ask that you rate this session. Number 1 is poor and number 5 is excellent. And the second question, I will use this material and ideas from this session for my future work in this area. The first option is strongly disagree, all the way up to the range of strongly agree. So I want to thank all of our panelists enormously. Everybody, you'll notice that there's a GLE Hangout Lounge. So if you want to go and just chat with other participants, there will be Hangout Lounges in various different languages, as well as one for chatting with SEI authors. So I'm going to head over there right now. I hope that I can see you there. Thanks again to our panelists and for all of you for attending. And we look forward to seeing you at the next GLE session.